Have you ever noticed how, even when everything seems to be silent around you, there is a constant noise inside your mind, as if thoughts never stopped, as if something invisible was vying for every space inside you? What if I told you that right now there might be a battle going on in there, and maybe you haven't even realized that you're being defeated little by little? It's strange, because on the outside, life goes on as normal. You talk to people, you go about your routine, you try to keep the faith, but inside there is a tiredness that no one sees. Thoughts that come back uninvited, memories that squeeze the heart, fears that come out of nowhere. And the more you try to control it, the more it seems to slip through your fingers, as if the mind had a will of its own, as if something was quietly feeding it. Now think sincerely. How many times have you tried to pray, but your mind wouldn't stop? How many times have you tried to get closer to God, but something inside you pulled you away? This isn't just distraction. There is something deeper going on, something that most ignore, but which completely defines the course of the spiritual life. The Bible reveals something that many have never realized. The greatest field of honor to God is not in visible attitudes, but in invisible thoughts. There is a spiritual, ancient, powerful key, hidden in something that seems too simple to be noticed, a way of living that transforms not only what you do, but what you think when no one is looking. And perhaps that's exactly what's missing. No more effort, no more empty attempts, but an understanding that changes everything from the root, because there is a way, a silent, deep, almost forgotten path. But it has the power to bring peace where there is confusion today, clarity where there is doubt, and strength where you only feel weakness. And as you continue here, something will start to change, not on the outside first, but inside your mind. Because what you are going to discover today is not theory. It is a spiritual secret that, when applied, begins to act even today. Along this journey, you will realize something that has perhaps never been clearer. Your thoughts are shaping the course of your spiritual life every day in silence. Each part will reveal profound truths from Scripture, showing how ordinary men learned to align their minds with God and experienced something extraordinary because of it. You will learn to identify thoughts that do not come from God, to silence inner voices that weaken you, and to develop spiritual discernment that sees beyond what is visible. The word itself says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, destroying counsels and bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ. And maybe it's no coincidence that you're here now. If this message has already started to speak to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this can bring this same light to other people who also need this spiritual awakening. And this is exactly where something begins to reveal itself in a deeper way. Because everything you've just realized about your thoughts leads us to a truth that few can see. Your mind is actually an invisible altar. It's not something that people see, it's not something that can be touched, but that's exactly where God seeks to dwell first. Before any attitude, before any word, before any visible decision, there is a thought. And it is in this quiet place that the honor of God really begins. Perhaps you have already tried to do the right thing on the outside, to maintain an appearance of faith, to seek to approach God with attitudes. But He realizes that inside there is a constant struggle. This is because the real altar has not yet been completely delivered. Abraham understood this in a way that few did. When God asked for Isaac, it was not just a test of outward obedience. It was an inward, deep, silent test. In Genesis 22:2 it is written, "Take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer it there as a burnt offering." But before I go up the mountain, before I prepare the altar, before any action, Abraham faced a war within his own mind. Imagine the thoughts trying to invade. What if God isn't right? What if I'm losing everything? What if there is no return? But even with all of this, he chose to honor God first in thought. He decided to trust before he understood. He aligned his mind before moving his hands. And that's exactly what changes everything. Because honoring God in the mind is not feeling like it. It is deciding to obey internally, even when emotions scream otherwise. It is to build an invisible altar where every thought passes through a filter. Does it please God, or does it distance me from Him? Many want to live deep spiritual experiences, but they ignore this essential detail. They want to feel the presence of God, but they do not care for the environment where that presence wants to dwell. Because when the mind is disordered, even faith becomes unstable. The word itself warns in Isaiah 29:13, "These people come to me with their mouth, but his heart is far from me." This shows that it is possible to appear close to God on the outside, but be distant on the inside. And it all starts in the mind. Maybe no one will see your thoughts, but God sees. And more than that, He wants to transform this place. Because when your mind becomes an altar, your entire life begins to change quietly but powerfully. And if, somehow, you feel that this truth is touching something inside you, maybe it's not by chance. Maybe it's God calling you back to that secret place. If this spoke to you, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple answer can mark the beginning of a transformation that you can't even imagine. And when this invisible altar begins to be revealed within you, something inevitable also becomes clear. Your mind is not a neutral place. It is a battlefield. A disputed territory where voices constantly compete for your attention, trying to influence your decisions, your emotions, and even your faith. Maybe you've felt it. Moments when, even after a strong spiritual experience, a sincere prayer, or even a clear victory, thoughts suddenly arise that don't make sense. Thoughts of fear, discouragement, doubt, as if something tried to erase what God has just done. And that's exactly what happened to Elias, a man who saw the impossible happen before his eyes. He prayed, and fire fell from heaven. He faced prophets, challenged an entire nation, and won. But soon after, everything changed. In 1 Kings 19:4 it is written, "And he asked for himself death and said, 'Enough is enough, O Lord, take my life now.'" How can someone who has seen so much power from God get to this point? The answer lies not in the external circumstances, but in the thoughts he has allowed to grow within the mind. The problem wasn't what happened around it. That's what began to echo within him. This reveals something profound and often overlooked. Spiritual experiences do not guarantee mental stability. You can live moments with God, and yet, if you don't watch your mind, wrong thoughts can creep in silently. And these thoughts do not come in an obvious way. They come as suggestions, like small doubts, like almost imperceptible distortions. An internal phrase, a what if, a maybe not, a this won't work. And when they are not confronted, they begin to take root. The word makes it clear in Ephesians 6:12, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness." This struggle doesn't just happen outside, it happens mostly inside the mind. And maybe here's something that can change the way you see everything. Not every thought that crosses your mind deserves to be accepted. Not every thought is yours, and not every thought comes from God. Honoring God in the mind requires vigilance. It requires noticing patterns. It requires identifying those ideas that always appear to weaken you, push you away, confuse you. Because what you don't confront over time controls you. But when you start discerning that, something changes. You stop being a hostage and become someone conscious within this war. And this awareness is already the beginning of a new spiritual position. If that word is stirring up a different alert in you, as if something is now being revealed within your own mind, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, thy servant hears." and leave your like on this video, because it can take this message to other people who also need to win this silent battle. And as you begin to perceive this battle within the mind, a truth emerges that completely changes the way you walk with God. This transformation does not happen all at once. It's not something instantaneous. It's not an isolated moment. It's not a one-time experience. It's a process, continuous, silent, and often invisible to the eye. Perhaps one of the greatest frustrations of those who seek God is exactly this expectation of rapid change. The person prays, makes an effort, tries to think differently, but in a short time, he realizes that certain old thoughts still come back, and this generates a feeling of guilt, as if something is wrong. But it is not. This is part of the process. The Apostle Paul himself, after living profound experiences, writing letters, teaching multitudes, still declared in Ephesians 4:23, "And be renewed in the spirit of your mind." He didn't say this to beginners, but to people who were already walking in faith. This shows that the renewal of the mind has no end while we are here. The natural mind will always tend to the easy way: doubt, fear, self-sufficiency, worry. It's like an automatic flow. If you don't do anything, it goes back to that pattern. But the renewed mind, it is built. She is trained. He learns to depend on God. And here's something that many people overlook. What you feed often becomes dominant within you. Therefore, God guides in Joshua 1:8. Meditate on it day and night, for then you will make your way prosperous. Meditating is not repeating empty words. It is to bring God's truth into the mind until it becomes stronger than any other thought. It's like planting something new inside of you every day. At first, it seems small, almost imperceptible, but over time, it grows and begins to replace what it once dominated. And maybe you've already noticed this without even noticing it clearly. When you hear something from God, something changes inside. When you expose yourself to the Word, your way of thinking begins to be adjusted, even if gradually. Honoring God in the mind is not about never having wrong thoughts again. It's about not allowing them to stay. It's about replacing, aligning, renewing every day. And this detail changes everything, because it takes the weight off perfection and puts you on the path of spiritual progress. If in some way you feel that you are in this process, even with failures, even with struggles, but without giving up, perhaps this is already a sign that God is working in your mind. And if this represents what you are living today, write in the comments, "God is renewing my mind." Sometimes stating this is the first step in further strengthening what He has already begun within you. And as this renewal takes place within you, a question begins to arise almost inevitably. How do you know if a thought comes from God or not? Because in the midst of so many thoughts, so many inner voices, so many emotions, it is not always easy to distinguish what is divine direction and what is just the fruit of one's own mind. And this difficulty is not new. Samuel, still young, went through exactly that. God was speaking to him, but he didn't recognize it. He heard the voice, but could not identify where it came from. In 1 Samuel 3:10, when he finally understands, he replies, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." But before that, he mistook the voice of God for the voice of Eli. This reveals something very important. Discerning God's voice is not automatic, is learned. It is a process of spiritual sensitivity that develops over time. Many people live confused precisely because of this. They think that God is silent, when in fact He has already spoken. But the mind is so full of noises, opinions, fears, that His voice is mixed with so many others. And here's a turning point. God's voice never conflicts with the Word. It does not generate confusion. It does not push to despair. It does not contradict what is already written. On the contrary, it brings peace, even when the direction is challenging. She aligns, she guides, she leads, Jesus made this clear in John 10:27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Notice, he didn't say that some listen or that only special people can. He said that his sheep hear. This includes those who are willing to learn. But listening requires attention. It requires slowing down the mind. It requires filtering out what's being fed inside you. Because the more noise inside, the harder it is to recognize the right voice. Honoring God in the mind also involves this: developing a sensitive spiritual ear. Start noticing patterns. Understand how God speaks to you. Identify that piece that doesn't make logical sense, but that confirms a direction, or even that inner discomfort that alerts you when something is not right. And little by little, something begins to change. That confusion is giving way to clarity. That constant doubt begins to diminish, and you realize that God has never been far away. You are just learning to recognize his voice. And perhaps, as you hear this now, something inside you is already starting to make more sense, like pieces that are silently fitting together. If you feel like you're in the process of learning to truly hear God, write in the comments, "Speak up, Lord, I want to listen." Sometimes a simple statement makes room for something profound to start happening inside you. And if you've made it this far, it's not by chance. There is something building inside your mind as you listen to each of these words. And at the end, let's step into a time of prayer that can mark a new beginning in how you think, feel, and connect with God. So stick around until the end, because that moment might be just what you needed to take a deeper step on that journey. And as you begin to discern God's voice, a new responsibility arises within your walk to guard what remains in your mind. Because it's not just about hearing the right voice, it's also about deciding what you allow to stay. Purity of thoughts is one of the most profound ways to honor God, precisely because it happens away from people's eyes. No one sees, no one applauds, no one corrects, but it is there that true fidelity is revealed. Jose lived this intensely. Not only was he physically tempted by Potiphar's wife, but before that, he was confronted within the mind. Because every temptation begins as an internal suggestion, an idea, a possibility. And it is at this moment that everything is decided. In Genesis 39:9, he declares, "How then should I do such wickedness and sin against God?" Notice, before any attitude, he already had a conviction formed within his mind. He didn't negotiate, he didn't feed, he didn't analyze the situation. He decided, and that changes everything. Because often the fall does not begin in visible error, but in the thought that has been allowed to remain too long. A thought that comes back, that insists, that begins to seem normal. And when you realize it, it has already created space within you. But Joseph teaches us something powerful. Purity is not the absence of temptation. It is a decision. It's choosing what stays and what goes. It is understanding that not everything that arrives needs to be hosted. The Word reinforces this in Philippians 4:8. Whatever is true, pure, think on this. This is not just advice, it is a clear direction. God is showing you where the mind should stay because He knows that what occupies your thoughts begins to shape your life. And perhaps here is something that few people take seriously. The level of your intimacy with God is directly linked to the type of thoughts you entertain when you are alone. Because it is in this secret place that your mind reveals who really rules your inner self. Honoring God in the mind is often saying no in silence. It is to reject a thought that no one else would see a problem with. It is to position yourself internally, even when it would be easier to give in. And at first, this may seem difficult, but over time, this choice begins to become natural, because what you protect strengthens. And perhaps as you listen to this, something inside you is being confronted directly, but also carefully. Not as an accusation, but as a call to a deeper level. If this message has awakened in you this desire to live a clearer mind, more aligned with God, then turn it into a small statement now. Write in the comments, "Lord, purify my thoughts," and leave your like on this video, because this can bring that same light to other people who are also seeking to live this inner transformation. And there is a point where many end up being defeated within this silent battle of the mind, not for lack of faith, but for excessive thinking about what hasn't even happened yet. Anxiety is born exactly there, not in the present, but in a future that the mind tries to control, predict, solve, without realizing that he is taking a place that belongs to God. Jesus was direct when he said at Matthew 6:25, "Do not be anxious about your life." It was not light advice, it was a profound instruction, because he knew that anxiety is not just an emotion. It's a pattern of thought that, if not stopped, begins to dominate everything. Maybe you've experienced it. Those moments when the mind doesn't stop. One thought pulls the other. What if it goes wrong? What if I can't? What if nothing changes? And when you realize it, your heart is already racing, your peace is gone, and all this without anything really happening. The anxious mind tries to control the unseen. She wants immediate answers, guarantees, security. But God works in trust. And that's exactly where there is a silent confrontation. Either you hand over control or keep trying to carry something that was never yours. Pedro lived this very clearly. While his eyes were on Jesus, he did the impossible. He walked on the water, but the moment his mind went out of focus and started to consider the wind, everything changed. In Matthew 14:30, it is written, "But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid." The wind has always been there, but it wasn't until he focused on that he started to sink, and this reveals something powerful. It is not only the circumstances that define your peace, but what occupies your mind in the midst of them. Two people may be living the same situation. One stands firm, the other despairs. The difference is not outside, it is inside. To honor God in the mind at this level is to trust even without understanding. It is choosing to rest, even when there are no visible signs of change. It is to say, in silence, "God, this is in your hands, not in mine." And that doesn't mean that anxious thoughts will never appear, but it does mean that they will not govern. Because you learn to redirect, not to feed, not to hold back. And little by little, something begins to happen. Your peace ceases to depend on answers and depends on the presence of God in your mind. If this message is finding space within you, as if it is bringing relief that you have not felt in a long time, perhaps this is already a sign that God is touching your mind now. And you can allow more people to experience that too. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. This word reaches other hearts that are also fighting in silence. Be a part of it now and help this message get to where it needs to go. And there is something even more subtle, more dangerous, and often completely invisible within this battle of the mind: spiritual lies. Because not everything that seems like a common thought is really harmless. Some ideas arrive disguised as logic, justification, sensation, but they carry distortions that little by little take you away from the truth. It was exactly like that at the beginning of everything. Eve did not fall because she was far from God. She was in the right environment, in the right place, with direct access to God's presence. But everything changed from a single distorted thought. In Genesis 3:4, the serpent says, "Ye shall not surely die." Notice, it was not a total denial of the truth. It was a subtle distortion, something that seemed small, almost insignificant. But it was enough to plant doubt. And when doubt set in, the mind began to negotiate what God had already established. And that's how it continues to happen today. The enemy rarely comes with an obvious lie. He works with half-truths, with thoughts that seem to make sense, with ideas that weaken your trust in God without you realizing it right away. It's okay to think like that. No one is watching. It won't make a difference. These phrases seem ordinary, but they carry a profound effect. Because when you accept a lie in your mind, it begins to influence your decisions, your emotions, and your spiritual direction. Now notice the contrast with Jesus. When he was tempted, he did not respond with opinion, nor with emotion, nor with human logic. He responded with the word. In Matthew 4:4 it is written, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." This reveals something powerful. A mind aligned with the word does not negotiate with lies. She acknowledges, confronts, and rejects. No matter how convincing the thought seems, if he contradicts what God has said, he does not stand. To honor God in the mind is to develop this kind of steadfastness. It is not giving space to ideas that distort the truth. It is remembering, even in the most difficult moments, what God has already declared. And maybe here's something that can open your eyes in a different way. Not every thought deserves attention, and some need to be stopped immediately. Because what you accept as truth within the mind begins to define your reality. And as you listen to this, perhaps God is bringing to your remembrance someone who needs that same deliverance, someone who is trapped in thoughts that don't come from him. If a name has come to your heart right now, don't ignore it. Write that name in the comments. Let's create a chain of prayer together, presenting these lives before God in faith. Because when the truth is released, lies lose strength and lives begin to be transformed. And after all that, there's an even deeper level. A place where the mind not only struggles, not only discerns, not only resists, but it remains. It remains steady, stable, anchored in something that does not change, even when everything around it seems unstable. Moses came to this place. In the middle of the desert, surrounded by pressure, responsibility, conflict, and uncertainty, he developed something rare, a mind totally centered on the presence of God. It wasn't just about times of prayer. It wasn't just about seeking direction in difficult situations. It was a continuous awareness. In Exodus 33:14, God declares, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And this rest was not without problems, because the desert was still there. The people were still difficult. The challenges have not disappeared, but something inside Moses was different. His mind was fixed in the presence, and perhaps here is something that completely transforms the way we live. Honoring God in the mind is not just remembering Him at specific moments, but maintaining the awareness that He is present in every thought, in every decision, in every moment of the day. It is carrying this presence while talking, while walking, while thinking, even in the simplest moments. Because when the mind connects with God in this way, something begins to change from the inside out. The instability begins to lose strength. That emotional roller coaster calms down. That feeling of being lost decreases. Not because everything has been resolved, but because your mind is no longer loose, it is grounded. Isaiah 26:3 reveals this directly. You will keep in peace him whose mind is set on you. It is not a peace that depends on what happens outside. It is a peace that is born from what is firm within. And that changes everything, because while many live reacting to circumstances, being carried away by thoughts that come and go, the one who learns to keep the mind in the presence begins to live differently, more stable, safer, more aware. And it is not something distant. It's not just for some. It's a path that starts with small decisions. Remembering God in the middle of the day. Bring your mind back when it gets lost. Choose to focus on presence, even when thoughts try to take you away. And little by little, this is no longer an effort, and it becomes nature. God's presence ceases to be a moment, and it becomes a state. And if you've made it this far, there's a reason. None of this is by chance. Something is lining up inside your mind, even if you can't fully explain it yet. But keep going, because what comes next can deepen this transformation even further. Stay until the end, because God still has something specific to speak directly to your heart. And when the mind begins to remain in the presence of God, something even more sensitive begins to happen. Its decisions cease to be impulsive and start to be guided. Because there are times in life when a single choice can open paths or close doors that will never open in the same way again. It's those moments when you feel the weight of the decision, when something inside you knows that it's not just another ordinary step, and it is exactly in these moments that honoring God in the mind becomes essential. Nehemiah lived one of these moments. On receiving the news that Jerusalem was in ruins, he was deeply shaken, but the most impressive thing was not the pain he felt. That's what he did with what was inside the mind. In front of the king, with a unique opportunity in his hands, he could have spoken impulsively, guided by emotion, haste, or even the fear of missing that chance. But Nehemiah did something that many ignore. In Nehemiah 2:4, it is written, "Then the king said to me, 'What do you ask of me now?' So I prayed to the God of heaven." It was a quick moment, almost invisible, but decisive. Before responding externally, he aligned himself internally. Before he spoke to the man, he spoke to God. Before making a decision, he organized his mind in the presence. And this reveals a powerful key. External decisions are reflections of thoughts that have already been aligned or disordered within you. No one decides right by chance. There is an internal process going on before. How many times do people regret it, not because they didn't know what to do, but why didn't they stop to align their minds before acting? The rush, the excitement, the fear. All of this can influence choices that carry profound consequences. But when you learn to honor God in your mind, something changes. You start to slow down before you decide. He begins to take his thoughts to God, even if it is in seconds, as Nehemiah did. And this creates space for a direction that comes not from human logic, but from heaven. Proverbs 3:5-6 declares, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and he will direct your paths." This straightening doesn't just happen in the big moments. It starts inside the mind, when you decide to trust before you even fully understand. And maybe what you need today is not more information, not more opinions, not more advice, but a moment of internal alignment, a moment of silence where your mind turns to God before any decision. Because when God rules your thoughts, he begins to direct your paths in a way that you alone could never do. And what once seemed confusing begins to gain clarity. Not because everything has been explained, but because your mind has been aligned. And there is an even deeper point within this journey. Because not all distorted thoughts start out of nowhere. Many of them are born from old wounds, from unresolved pain, from experiences that have marked the soul in a silent way. And over time, these marks begin to influence how you think, interpret, and react to life. A wounded soul begins to see everything through pain. Small situations seem bigger than they really are. Words take on a different weight. Fear becomes more frequent. And without realizing it, the mind starts repeating patterns that keep this pain alive. But David shows us something powerful. He was not ignorant of what he felt, but he did not surrender to it either. In Psalm 42:5 he declares, "Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you troubled within me? Hope in God." Notice what he's doing. He is talking to his own soul. This is profound, because instead of letting pain lead his thoughts, he decides to confront what is inside him. It redirects your mind. He does not accept that what he feels becomes the final truth. And here's a key that changes everything. Feeling is not the problem. Allowing the feeling to rule your mind is what generates the imbalance. To honor God in the mind is to choose the truth, even when emotion tries to speak louder. How many times do negative thoughts arise based on past experiences? This always happens to me. Nothing will change. I can't. These phrases are not born out of nowhere. They are fed by wounds that have not yet been completely healed. But God doesn't just see that pain. It offers restoration. In Isaiah 61:3 it is written, "To command upon the mourners, let ornament be given to them for ashes, oil of joy for sorrow." This means exchange. God does not ignore pain, He transforms, and this transformation begins in the mind. When you stop feeding thoughts that reinforce the wound and begin to bring to mind what God says about you, about your life, about your future, it's not instantaneous, but it's real. Gradually, what once seemed heavy begins to lose strength. That pain that dominated his thoughts begins to be replaced by a new perspective. And maybe, as you listen to this, there's something inside you that still hurts, something that no one sees, but that influences your thoughts every day. And today, God is not accusing you for this. He is calling you to a healing process that starts from the inside out. If this word has found that place within you, even if silently, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a simple statement is the beginning of a healing that the mind alone could never achieve. And there is a moment in life when the person realizes, even if in silence, that something has changed inside them. Not necessarily on the outside, but on the inside. A sense of distance, of disconnection, as if before it was easier to feel the presence of God, but now everything seems drier, more distant, more confused. And the most curious thing is that many times this does not happen abruptly. It is something gradual, small distractions, decisions, thoughts. And when you realize it, the mind is no longer in the same place as before. But the story of the prodigal son reveals something deeply hopeful, because the change that took you away can also be the same one that brings you back. In Luke 15:17 it is written, "And he came to himself and said, 'How many of my father's hirelings have an abundance of bread?'" This making it into itself is the key point. Before any physical step, before any external change, something happened within the mind. He woke up. He came out of the mental confusion he was in. He saw clearly again, and that changes everything, because honoring God in the mind also involves recognizing when you've walked away. Not with guilt, not with condemnation, but with conscience. It is realizing that your thoughts are no longer aligned as before, and then making an internal decision to return. Many people think that they need to change everything on the outside first, and then get closer to God. But the truth is the opposite. Reconnection begins within. It starts with the thought that says, "I need to go back." And when that thought arises, something spiritual has already begun to happen, because no one seeks God with all his heart without he himself already touching that person from within. Jeremiah 29:13 states, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." This is not just a promise, it is a guarantee. God does not hide from those who decide to truly seek him. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is a feeling inside you that you cannot fully explain, like a spiritual longing, a desire to reconnect, to return to that place of peace that you once experienced. This is no coincidence. This is the moment when everything can start to change again. Not by effort, but by decision. Because when the mind goes back to God, the rest starts to follow that movement. If you are here, it is because God allowed it, and I believe He wants to reveal something even deeper to you. Don't leave this video before you receive that, which can rekindle within you a connection that seemed lost, because what comes next can touch exactly the point you need most today. And there is something that few realize, but that is happening silently every day. a constant distraction trying to steal what God is building inside your mind. It's not something noisy. It's not something obvious. On the contrary, it is subtle. It is progressive. It is almost imperceptible. You start focused, you start searching, you start aligned, but little by little, small distractions come in. A thought here, another there. Unnecessary worries, occupations that take up too much space, things that seem harmless but that take your mind away from God's presence without you realizing it. And when you realize it, you are no longer with the same sensitivity as before. That ease of feeling God decreases, that clarity is being lost. And it wasn't a sudden drop. It was a gradual disconnect. Jesus warned about just that. In Matthew 26:41, he said, "Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation." The disciples were there, close to him, living a deep spiritual moment, and yet they slept. But it wasn't just a physical sleep. It was a spiritual relaxation. It was a mind that ceased to watch, and that's the point, because the mind that does not watch becomes vulnerable. It doesn't take a big mistake to turn away from God. All it takes is a distracted mind long enough. 1 Peter 5:8 clearly reinforces this. Be sober, watch, because the devil walk around. This means that there is constant vigilance being required. I don't eat fear, but as consciousness. To honor God in the mind is to live with this active discernment. It's noticing when something is trying to take up too much space inside you. It's identifying when your attention is being diverted from what really matters. And perhaps here is something that needs to be said clearly. Not everything that occupies your mind deserves to be there. And some distractions aren't just distractions. They are disguised deviations. Because while your mind is occupied with what it does not edify, it fails to strengthen itself in what it really sustains. And this does not happen all at once. It's gradually, one day after another, one thought after another. But in the same way that distraction enters silently, vigilance can also be restored. The moment you decide to pay attention again, the moment you bring your mind back, the moment you choose not to live on automatic, and that changes everything, because a mindful mind begins to notice things that previously went unnoticed. He begins to discern what comes from God and what does not. He begins to position himself more firmly. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is awakening, as if he were turning his attention to what really matters. If you feel that God has been good, even in the midst of distractions and challenges, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes recognizing this is the first step in keeping your mind steady and vigilant in his presence. And when this vigilance begins to become part of your life, something naturally starts to happen. Your mind begins to reflect what is being built within you, and even if you don't realize it right away, the people around you start to notice. Because the greatest evidence of God in someone's life is not only in what they say, but in the way she thinks, reacts, decides, and positions herself. There is something silent but extremely strong in a mind that has been transformed. Daniel lived exactly that. He was in an environment completely contrary to his faith. Everything around him pressed for him to adapt, to mold, to blend in. But before any external pressure, he had already made an internal decision. In Daniel 1:8 it is written, Daniel sat down in his heart not to defile himself. Notice. This decision did not happen at the time of temptation. It was taken before, inside the mind, in the place where no one could see. He had already defined who he was and how far he would go. And that made all the difference, because when the pressure came, he didn't have to decide. He had already decided, and perhaps this is one of the greatest secrets of a mind that honors God. It stands first. She doesn't wait for the difficulty to arrive and then try to react. It is already aligned, Romans 8:6 states, "The carnal mind is death, but the mind of the Spirit is life and peace." This shows that there is a constant direction going on within the mind. Or does it lean towards that which pushes it away, or for that which brings us closer to God? And this inclination is not only spiritual, it becomes visible, because a mind inclined to the Spirit begins to generate peace where there was confusion before. It begins to generate balance where there was previously an impulsive reaction. It begins to generate firmness where there was instability before. And people notice, even if you don't say anything, even if you don't try to prove anything, there is something about the way you think and behave that communicates. Maybe you've seen it in someone, a person who transmits peace, who does not despair easily, who maintains a different posture even in difficult situations. This is no coincidence. This is a reflection of a mind aligned with God, and that kind of life becomes a living testimony. It doesn't need a lot of words, it doesn't need long explanations. The very way of living already points to something greater, and it starts inside the mind, in the place where decisions are formed, where thoughts are filtered, where truth is chosen daily, and little by little, without realizing it, your life begins to speak for you. This word is not for everyone. If you're here, there's a reason. God is working on something deeper than just listening. He is forming within you a mindset that can transform everything around you. So stay until the end, because there is still something that can completely change the way you see your own walk with God. And when the mind begins to be transformed, aligned, and strengthened, something extraordinary begins to happen quietly. God begins to entrust revelations, not because the person has become perfect, but because his mind has become available. There is a profound difference between desiring purpose and being prepared to receive it. Because God's purpose does not begin in the visible world, it is born within the mind, as a seed, as an image, as a direction that does not yet make complete sense. Jose lived this in a remarkable way. Still young, without position, without influence, without resources, God put into his mind something that would change entire destinies. In Genesis 37:5 it is written, Joseph had a dream and told it to his brethren. That dream wasn't just a random scene, it was a revelation. It was the beginning of something that would take years to accomplish. But before any external achievement, it already existed within Joseph's mind. And perhaps here is something that many do not realize. God does not reveal purpose to distracted or disordered minds. It reveals to minds that know how to keep, protect, and value what they receive. Because not everything that God shows should be exposed immediately. Not everything that is born inside you should be shared ahead of time. There is a process between receiving and manifesting, and during this process, the mind is tested. Thoughts of doubt arise, questions arise. Contrary situations try to invalidate what has been revealed, and this is where many give up. Not because God failed, but because they could not sustain the vision within the mind. Joseph went through this. It was rejected, sold, forgotten. Everything seemed contrary to the dream. But what God planted within him lived on, even when nothing around him confirmed it. Jeremiah 1:5 states, "Before I formed you, I knew you." It shows that purpose doesn't start when you understand. It existed even before you were born. And honoring God in the mind is also this, protecting what he plants within you. Do not allow negative thoughts to steal your vision. Not to allow outside opinions to destroy something that God is still building, because purpose needs to be sustained internally before it can be manifested externally. And maybe you still don't see clearly all that God has for your life. But if there is something inside you that insists, that remains, that does not disappear even with time, maybe that's a seed that came from him. And everything that God sows, when it is kept in the right mind, at the right time, is fulfilled. And even when you begin to understand purpose, align thoughts, and protect what God plants within you, there are still times when the inside seems to fall apart. Moments when the mind is filled with conflicts, when emotions are mixed, when thoughts seem too heavy to carry. Jeremiah lived exactly that. Known as the prophet of tears, he did not hide his pain. He felt deeply, saw destruction all around him, and carried an intense emotional weight. But what makes his story so powerful isn't the pain he faced. That's what he did with it inside his mind. In the midst of the chaos, he made a quiet but transformative decision. In Lamentations 3:21-23, he declares, "I want to call to mind what can give me hope. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed." Notice this carefully. He chose to remember. He didn't deny the pain. He didn't ignore reality, but he decided to direct his mind to something bigger than what he was feeling. And here's a truth that can change everything. The mind will always cling to something. The question is to choose what she will cling to, because when pain becomes the center, everything around feels heavier. But when the mind begins to remember the promises, something begins to change inside. This does not eliminate suffering instantly, but it does change the way it is faced. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 declares, "The God of all comfort, comfort us in all our tribulation." This means that God's comfort does not depend on the absence of problems, but on his presence within the mind that chooses to turn to him. And maybe here's something you need to hear clearly. You don't have to wait for everything to get better to have peace. Peace begins when your mind decides to lean on God, even when everything still seems uncertain, because consolation is not forgetting the pain, is not allowing her to be the only voice within you. And this is a daily exercise. Bring to memory, remember God's faithfulness. Remember what he has already done. Reinforce what he has already promised, even when the mind tries to take you to the opposite side. And little by little, what seemed unbearable begins to lose strength. Not because it disappeared, but because its mind found a safer place to stay. And perhaps right now, as you listen to this, God is inviting you to do just that. To change your focus, to redirect your thoughts, to remember what still sustains you. And just as that word has come to you, there are many other people in need of that same comfort right now. When you interact with this video, leaving your like, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you help this message reach hearts that are facing silent battles. And so together, this current of faith continues to reach lives that need this care from God. And after all this, there is a skill that separates those who only hear from God from those who truly walk with him. Discernment. Because it's not enough to have thoughts. It is necessary to know how to evaluate them. It's not enough to feel. You have to know how to filter. Not every thought that sounds good comes from God. Not every feeling that seems true should be followed. And this is exactly where many get confused, because they live guided by what they feel at the moment, without realizing that emotions can also be influenced, distorted, and even deceived. Solomon understood this early on in his journey. When he had the opportunity to ask for anything, he did not ask for wealth, nor power, nor victory over enemies. In 1 Kings 3:9, he asked, "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people." He asked for discernment. This reveals something profound. Those who have discernment see beyond appearance. He can perceive what is not visible. It manages to separate what seems right from what really is. And that discernment begins in the mind. That's where the filter happens. It is there that you decide whether a thought will be accepted or rejected. That's where you evaluate whether it's aligned with God or just seems to be. Because there are thoughts that come with the appearance of truth, but carry deviation. Ideas that sound good, but don't come from the right source. And without discernment, all of this can be accepted without question. Hebrews 5:14 states, "The senses exercised to discern both good and evil. This shows that discernment is not automatic. It is developed. It grows as you exercise your mind in the Word, in the presence, in the watchfulness. And that takes practice. It requires stopping and reflecting. It demands not to accept everything immediately. It requires asking internally, is this in line with what God says? Does this create peace or confusion? Does it bring me closer or push me away? To honor God in the mind is to create that spiritual filter. It is not living on automatic. It's not allowing any thought to have free access to your interior. And little by little, something begins to change. You start to notice things that you didn't notice before. Begin to identify patterns. You begin to recognize when something is not from God, even if it seems convincing. This is spiritual maturity. It's not about knowing more. It's about seeing better. It's about taking a deep look at what's going on inside you, because an undiscerning mind is easily influenced. But a trained mind becomes firm, secure, and difficult to deceive. And the more discernment grows, the more you begin to notice something that previously went unnoticed. There are times when all thoughts seem to go against what God has promised. It's as if logic screams something, while faith silently pointed in another direction. Abraham lived through exactly this conflict. God had made a promise that, in human eyes, was impossible. Time passed, circumstances didn't help, the body no longer responded. Everything around seemed to deny what God had said. And it is at this point that the battle in the mind intensifies. Because it's not just about believing, it's about holding that belief when everything inside you starts to question. Romans 4:20-21 describes this strikingly, and he did not doubt the promise of God through unbelief, being very sure that what he had promised was also powerful to do so. That doesn't mean that contrary thoughts didn't come. It means that he did not allow these thoughts to become stronger than the promise. And perhaps here is something that needs to be understood clearly. Faith is not the absence of contrary thoughts. It is the decision not to surrender to them. The natural mind will always try to explain, calculate, predict. She seeks security in what is visible. But faith rests on what God has said, even when there are no signs yet. Hebrews 11:1 states, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for." This means that faith sustains that which is not yet seen. It holds firm what has not yet happened. And this requires an internal posture. It requires constantly remembering the promise. It requires bringing to mind what God has spoken, even when other voices try to take up space. Because thoughts will arise, doubts will appear, questions will try to settle in. But honoring God in your mind is choosing which voice you will feed. Abraham did not become the father of a great promise because he never doubted. He became one because he decided to believe beyond doubt. And maybe you're living in exactly that kind of moment right now. A place where everything seems to say it won't happen, where thoughts try to weaken your hope, where logic seems higher than faith. But it is precisely there that true faith begins to manifest itself, not when everything is easy, but when you choose to stay, even without seeing. And if that word is finding you in that place, as a silent confirmation that you need to keep believing, then turn that into a simple statement now. Write in the comments, "God takes care of me," because sometimes stating this is exactly what your mind needs to stay grounded, even in the midst of contrary thoughts. And when the mind begins to stand in faith, to discern, to resist, and to abide, something even deeper happens. He stops living only for himself. Because a mind that is truly aligned with God is not limited to one's own thoughts, problems, or needs. She begins to carry others before him. And this is where many don't realize it, but there is a higher level of honor to God in the mind: intercession. Not just as words spoken in prayer, but as a constant inner positioning. Interceding is when you start to think of people as God does, when situations come to your mind not to worry you, but to lead you to present it before God. Moises lived this intensely. The people had sinned, had gone astray, and God's justice was just and necessary. But Moses stood in the middle. In Exodus 32:32, he declares, "Now therefore forgive your sin, if not, blot me out of your book." This was not just a prayer, it was a deep mental positioning. He took on the spiritual weight of that situation within his mind. He didn't just think about himself, he carried others before God. And this reveals something powerful. When your mind is aligned with God, it is not indifferent. It becomes sensitive. People come to your mind. Situations arise in your thinking, and this is not by chance. Ezekiel 22:30 shows God's heart when it says, "I have sought out of them a man to stop the wall, but I found no one." This shows that God is looking for people who are willing to take that place, not only externally, but within the mind. To honor God in the mind is to use your thoughts as a continuous altar. It is transforming memories into intercession. It is not allowing worries to become burdens, but to transform them into delivery. And maybe you've lived it, when someone comes to your mind out of nowhere, when a situation appears in your thinking without explanation. Often, this is no coincidence. It's an invitation to take a stand, to intercede, to participate in something that God is doing, even without seeing. And little by little, your mind is no longer just a place of battles, and it becomes a place of purpose, a place where God finds someone available to cooperate with him. And this completely changes the way of living, because you stop being just someone who seeks, and he becomes someone who also sustains others in prayer, in thought, in faith. And what you will realize from here can further transform the way you see your own mind, because there is an even deeper level that few access. And what comes now may be exactly the answer you didn't know you needed. Stay until the end, because there is something being prepared that can completely change your connection with God. And there are times when the mind seems to become a dark place, not for lack of faith, but for being overweight. Thoughts begin to pile up, hope diminishes, and what was once clear now seems distant. It's as if something inside you loses its light, even without you understanding exactly when it started. Elijah came to this place, a man who had already seen miracles, who had already experienced the power of God in an extraordinary way, but who suddenly found himself dominated by thoughts of discouragement, fear, and loneliness. It was not a lack of God, it was a drain inside the mind. But what God does next reveals something profound about how he works with us in those moments. In 1 Kings 19:11-12 it is written, "And behold, the Lord was passing by, but the Lord was not in the wind, not even in the earthquake, nor in the fire, and after the fire a still, small voice." God did not enter with force. It didn't come with a heavy confrontation. It didn't bring any noise. It came softly, with a voice almost imperceptible, but enough to reach that broken place inside Elijah's mind. And this reveals something that many do not realize. The restoration of the mind does not happen in chaos. It happens in stillness. It is not in the excess of voices, but in silence where God speaks in a personal way. Because when the mind is tired, overloaded, wounded, she doesn't need any more pressure. She needs presence. Psalm 34:18 declares, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." This means that exactly in those moments, when everything seems dark inside, God is not far away. He is closer than ever. To honor God in the mind, on this level, is to allow him to enter into these broken thoughts. It's not hiding, not ignoring, not running away, but make room for him to bring healing, peace, and hope. And little by little, something begins to happen. What once seemed heavy begins to ease. That darkness begins to give way to small lights. Not all at once, but step by step. Because true hope is not born of perfect circumstances. It is born when God begins to speak within the mind again. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is a part within you that is exactly like this. Tired, overwhelmed, in need of that gentle touch from God. And it is in this place, silent and profound, that He begins to restore everything that seemed lost within you. And after experiencing this touch of God restoring the mind, an even deeper awareness arises. Not every fall happens suddenly. Many begin in silent cycles that are repeated within the mind. Small patterns, recurring thoughts, seemingly harmless choices. But that, over time, create a path. Samson did not lose his strength in a single moment. His story was not marked by an isolated decision, but by a pattern that repeated itself. He approached danger, played with limits, ignored signs, until the moment came when he no longer realized what was happening inside him. In Judges 16:20 it is written, "And she said, 'The Philistines are coming upon you, Samson.' And he awoke from his sleep. But he did not know that the Lord had already departed from him." This is one of the strongest points of this story. He didn't know. He continued to act as before. But something essential had already been lost. And this reveals something that needs to be taken seriously. Destructive mental cycles create spiritual blindness. When a wrong thought is repeated too many times, it starts to seem normal. What used to bother you no longer bothers you. What seemed wrong begins to be justified, and that's how many move away, not all at once, but gradually, thought after thought, pick after pick. Galatians 6:7 states, "Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap." This speaks not only of external actions, but also of what you plant inside your mind, because every thought fed is a seed, and over time, this bears fruit. Honoring God in the mind at this level requires something that is not always easy. Interruption. Interrupt patterns. Perceive cycles. Have the courage to recognize that certain thoughts are always taking you to the same place. And maybe you've already realized that. Thoughts that come back, situations that repeat themselves, reactions that seem automatic. This is no coincidence. This is a cycle. But the good news is that every cycle can be broken. The moment you become aware, the moment you decide not to feed it anymore, the moment you change direction, even if it's difficult at first. Because spiritual victory is not just about resisting a moment, it is breaking with patterns that try to establish themselves within the mind. And when this rupture begins, something new also begins to be born. A new way of thinking, a new way of reacting, a new path. And perhaps, as you listen to this, God is showing you exactly which cycle needs to be broken, something that has been repeated. Something that can no longer continue. If you feel this clearly now, don't keep it just to yourself. Write in the comments your prayer request, what you want to see transformed, what needs divine intervention. Because when you bring it to light, you're no longer fighting alone. You are entering a stream of faith where God begins to act in a powerful way. And when you start to break cycles and see patterns that were previously hidden, a deep need arises within the mind to find something that brings stability. Because after so many internal struggles, so many thoughts that come and go, the mind needs a firm point, something that doesn't change, something that doesn't depend on circumstances. And this is exactly where God's promises come in. They're not just pretty words, they are anchors. They are what keeps the mind steady when everything around seems unstable. Joshua 21:45 declares, "No promise failed of all the good words which the Lord had spoken." None. This means that throughout history, God has never failed to fulfill what He has said, even when it seemed impossible, even when it took time, even when everything indicated otherwise. He remained faithful. Caleb understood this deeply. He received a promise, but did not see the immediate fulfillment. Years passed, decades, situations have changed, people have changed, but his mind remained steadfast. While others gave up, while many lost hope, Caleb held within himself what God had spoken. He didn't live based on what he saw, but in what he remembered. And this reveals something powerful. The mind that clings to God's promises does not become hostage to time. Hebrews 10:23 states, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, because he who promised is faithful." Hold on tight. This requires decision, because thoughts will try to escape, doubt will try to enter, time will try to weaken, but there is a constant choice to stay. Honoring God in the mind is just that, not letting go of what he has already said, even when everything seems to contradict it. It is to bring to mind the promises, to repeat internally, to reinforce within oneself what God has already declared, because the promise does not lose strength over time. The one who needs to strengthen himself is the mind that carries this promise, and maybe you're living in a time like that, where God has already spoken something to his heart, but circumstances have not followed, where time passed and doubt began to arise. But it is exactly in this place that the anchor needs to be dropped, not in what you see, but in what God has said. Because when the mind is fixed on the promise, it is not carried away by the waves of uncertainty. It remains, and this permanence changes everything. Because that which is held within you at the right time manifests itself outside. And when the mind begins to settle on the promises, a new level of confrontation becomes inevitable, because inside you there is a constant dispute. It is not something external, it is not something visible, but it is real. Every day, in simple thoughts, in small decisions, in almost automatic reactions. This battle takes place. Paul clearly describes this in Galatians 5:17, "For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh." This means that there are two inclinations trying to rule your mind. One pulls you to the impulse, to the immediate, to what seems easiest. The other leads you to what is eternal, to what pleases God, even when it requires renunciation. And this decision doesn't just happen in big moments. It happens in the detail, in the thought you accept or reject, in the choice that no one sees, in the answer you decide to give internally. Jesus showed this in a profound way in Gethsemane. Faced with one of the most difficult moments of his journey, he did not deny what he felt. He expressed, he recognized, but he did not allow that to govern his decision. In Luke 22:42, he declares, "Not my will, but yours be done." This is submission. It's not weakness. It is strength. It is consciously choosing that God's will is greater than any momentary impulse. And maybe here is something that completely changes the way we see spiritual force. It's not about never feeling conflict. It's about deciding correctly even when conflict exists, because the mind will always be the place of that choice. Every day, thoughts will come up trying to take you in different directions. And honoring God in the mind is exactly that. Choose over and over again that which is aligned with Spirit. Romans 8:14 states, "All who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God." Being guided is not automatic. It involves sensitivity, it involves decision, it involves willingness to follow even when it is not the easiest. And over time, something starts to happen. What once seemed difficult begins to become more natural. The mind is being trained. The spirit now has more space. And that internal struggle, which once seemed uncontrolled, begins to be won more clearly. But it all starts with a choice. Simple, silent, daily. And maybe today, exactly today, there is something inside you asking for that decision. Something you know you need to align with, something that God has already shown, but that still requires a step of submission. And if that word has found that place within you as a clear and personal calling, then answer it simply but truthfully. Write in the comments, "God chose me," because recognizing this changes how you decide, and it strengthens your mind to live out exactly what He has for you. And when this submission to the Spirit begins to shape His mind, something new reveals itself almost imperceptibly. God begins to speak in the details. Not only in great moments, not only in remarkable experiences, but in small things that go unnoticed by a distracted mind. Because the truth is that God has never stopped speaking. The problem is often not in the absence of the voice, but in the lack of attention. Gideon lived this very clearly. He was surrounded by doubts, insecurity, and fear. Even so, there was a sincere desire within him to understand what God was doing. In Judges 6:17 he says, "If I have now found favor in your sight, give me a sign." And God answered. But the most important thing was not just the signal. It was Gideon's ability to perceive, interpret, and recognize that it came from God. Because a sign without discernment can be ignored, an inattentive response can go unnoticed. And that's exactly what happens to many. God moves, responds, directs. But the mind is so busy, so full, so fast-paced that it cannot perceive. Amos 3:7 states, "Surely the Lord God will do nothing but reveal His secret to His servants." This means that God does not act without communicating. He speaks, He reveals, He directs, but it requires a sensitive mind. To honor God in the mind at this level is to develop that sensitivity. It's paying attention to the details. It is to notice when something is repeated, when a word touches deeper, when a direction begins to form smoothly but steadily. And many times it doesn't come as something spectacular. It comes as an impression, like a thought that comes back, like a peace that cannot be explained, like a nuisance that alerts. But to realize this, the mind needs to be present, it needs to be connected, it needs to be available, because a distracted mind loses signs. But an attentive mind begins to see God moving, even in the little things. And when this starts to happen, life changes. You stop living on automatic and starts to live with perception. He begins to notice that God is closer than He seemed, that He is talking more than you imagined, and maybe right now God is already trying to show you something that you didn't realize before, but that now starts to make sense. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and it may not come in the way you imagined, but in the way you hadn't yet learned to perceive. So stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can open your eyes in a way that you have never experienced before. And the more your mind becomes sensitive to God's voice, the more you begin to notice something that once seemed small, but which actually has a huge impact. The people around you are shaping the way you think. No one builds a mindset alone. Even when you believe you're deciding on your own, there are quiet influences going on all the time. The way you see life, how you interpret situations, how you react to challenges. All of this is affected by the environment in which you are inserted. And this can bring you closer to God or push you away without you noticing. The early church understood this principle deeply. In Acts 2:42 it is written, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship." It wasn't just about learning individually. It was about living together. It was about building a collective mindset aligned with God. They shared, learned, corrected, strengthened each other, and this created an environment where faith not only existed, it grew. Because when you're surrounded by people who think like God thinks, your mind starts to align naturally. But when you are in environments that weaken faith, that feed doubt, that normalize what distances you, your mind also feels this impact. Proverbs 13:20 states, "He that walks with the wise will become wise." This is not just advice, it is an inevitable consequence. You become similar to that which is constantly around you. And perhaps here is something that needs to be observed more closely. What are the voices that you have allowed to influence your mind? What conversations have you been overhearing? What environments do you frequent? What thoughts are being reinforced through these connections? Honoring God in the mind also involves choices. Choices of environment, relationship, proximity. It's not about walking away from people, but about understanding who is strengthening your faith and who is weakening your mind. Because thoughts are built in community. They are reinforced, repeated, influenced. And when you position yourself in a spiritually healthy environment, your mind finds support to remain steadfast. And little by little, what was difficult before begins to become lighter. Because you're no longer fighting alone. There is a collective strength, a shared direction, a construction that happens together, and maybe this message has come to you precisely to make you realize something that needs to be adjusted around you. Because when the environment changes, the mind also begins to change, and if that word spoke to you, if you feel like God is showing you something through that, don't let it slide. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay connected. Because messages like this can continue to strengthen your mind and keep you aligned with what God is doing in your life. And when you begin to understand the influence of environments and people, something even deeper reveals itself. True transformation never starts from the outside. It begins silently, within the mind, in the place where no one sees. But that defines everything. Zacchaeus is one of the clearest examples of this. He was not just an ordinary man. He carried wrong choices, questionable decisions, and a marked reputation. But everything began to change in a single encounter with Jesus. And the most interesting thing is that Jesus did not start by demanding external changes. He didn't point out mistakes. He didn't impose rules. He didn't pressure behaviors. He came in, and something inside Zacchaeus was transformed, and this transformation was so profound, so real, that attitudes began to change naturally. In Luke 19:8, Zacchaeus declares, "Behold, I give to the poor half of my possessions." Notice, nobody told him to do that. It was not an obligation. It was a result. The result of a mind that was touched, of a heart that has been renewed, of a consciousness that has been awakened, and this reveals something powerful. When God transforms the interior, the exterior becomes a consequence. It's not a forced effort, it is true change. Ezekiel 36:26 states, "And I will give you a new heart." This doesn't just talk about emotion. It speaks of a new way of thinking, of feeling, of deciding, a new nature being formed within you, because many people try to change behaviors without transforming thoughts. They try to adjust attitudes but ignore the root. And that's why they get frustrated, because change is not sustainable. But when the mind is renewed, everything starts to align. Intentions change, desires adjust, priorities are reorganized. And what once seemed difficult starts to make sense. To honor God in the mind is to allow this process. It is making room for Him to transform not only what you do, but why you do. Not just your choices, but their motivations. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is something inside you that has already begun to change, even if it is not yet visible. A new thought, a new perception, a new discomfort with what once seemed normal. This is a sign of transformation, because everything that God begins within, sooner or later it manifests itself outside. And when that change is true, it doesn't have to be forced. It just happens. And as this inner transformation begins to manifest, there arises an essential need to protect all that God is building within you. Self-control. Because it is not enough to be transformed, it is necessary to sustain this transformation on a daily basis. The mind, when it is not protected, becomes vulnerable to impulses. Quick thoughts, hasty decisions, automatic reactions. All of this can, in a few moments, compromise what took time to build. Proverbs 25:28 paints a strong image. As a city that is broken down, which has no walls, so is the man who has no self-control. A city without walls is exposed. Anything can enter, any attack can happen, there is no protection, and so is the mind without domination. No internal limits, no surveillance, no control. Any thought finds space. Any impulse gains strength, and little by little what was firm begins to weaken. But when there is self-control, something changes. It's not that thoughts stop coming, it's that they do not find freedom to remain. There is a limit. There is an internal position that says, this does not enter, this does not stay, this does not govern. Paul speaks of this very clearly in 1 Corinthians 9:27. I subdue my body, lest I myself should fail. He wasn't just talking about external actions. He was talking about internal discipline, of a mind that does not get carried away easily. And maybe here is something that completely changes the way we see spiritual freedom. Freedom is not doing everything you want. It is having control to choose what should be done, because without domination, the person becomes a hostage to himself, hostage to emotions, impulses, momentary desires, but with mastery, it becomes firm, stable, safe. To honor God in the mind is to set these inner boundaries. It is to decide in advance what you accept and what you reject. It's not negotiating with what you already know that drives you away, and that takes practice. It requires awareness. It often requires saying no to yourself, but each time you do that, something inside you gets stronger. And little by little, what once seemed difficult begins to become natural, because your mind learns. It adjusts, it is strengthened, and that protects everything that God is doing inside of you. Few people will understand this message, but if you're here, it's no accident. There is something being dealt with in a deep way in your mind, something that can completely change the way you live. So stay until the end, because what is yet to come can take you to a level of understanding that few reach. And as that dominance begins to settle within you, a powerful truth needs to be revealed. You were not born to be dominated by your thoughts. You were not created to be hostage to what goes through your mind. There is a spiritual authority available, and many have never learned how to use it. Jesus clearly demonstrated this. He didn't just teach, he exercised authority. In Luke 4:36 it is written, "With authority and power he commands." He did not negotiate with what was contrary. He did not accept passively. He took a stand, and this authority did not remain only in him. In Luke 10:19, he declares, "Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents." This means that there is a liberated authority for those who live in alignment with God. But this authority needs to be exercised. And here's something that completely changes the way you deal with the mind. Not every thought needs to be tolerated. Some need to be confronted. Others need to be rejected immediately. Because when you don't exercise authority, your mind becomes an open place where any thought enters, stays, and begins to influence. But when you understand who you are in God, something changes. You start to position yourself. A thought of fear arises, and you don't accept it. A thought of doubt appears, and you confront the truth. A thought that distances you from God tries to settle in, and you reject it. This is not human strength. It is spiritual positioning. Honoring God in the mind is just that, not allowing that which is not from Him to rule within you. It is understanding that you have the authority to decide what stays and what leaves. And perhaps, for a long time you believed that you had no control. That it was just like that thoughts just came and you had to live with them. But this is not true. You can rule your mind, not by His own strength, but by the authority that God has given you. And when this begins to be practiced, something powerful happens. The mind ceases to be a place of confusion, and it becomes a place of order, of clarity, positioning, because thoughts are not orders. These are suggestions, and you decide which ones you accept, and that decision, when aligned with God, completely changes how you live, react, and stand firm, even in the midst of the unseen battles happening within you. And when this authority begins to be exercised, something even higher becomes possible. The mind not only protects itself, it does not just position itself, but it begins to dwell on another level, a level where thoughts are no longer dominated by what is earthly, and they begin to reflect that which is eternal. Enoch lived just that. The Bible does not describe great deeds. It does not detail extraordinary achievements, but it does reveal something that is even deeper. In Genesis 5:24, it is written, "And Enoch walked with God, and he didn't show up again." He didn't just believe in God, he walked with God. And walking with God is not just an external act. It's a constant connection. It is a mind that remains connected, conscious, sensitive. It is to live in such an aligned way that thoughts begin to reflect the sky. And maybe here's something that completely changes the way we understand intimacy with God. It's not just about separate moments. It's about continuity. It's not just praying at certain times. It is to keep the mind connected throughout the day, because the greater the intimacy, the more natural it becomes to think as God thinks. Colossians 3:2 states, "Set your mind on the things above." This is not just spiritual advice, it is a practical direction. It is an invitation to elevate the mind above what is temporary, above what is unstable, above what changes. And this does not happen automatically. It happens through communion, through proximity, through a constant relationship. And little by little, something begins to change inside you. Thoughts that were once common begin to lose space. What used to occupy his mind no longer has the same strength. And a new way of thinking begins to emerge. Lighter, clearer, more aligned, not because you're forcing it, but because it is connected. To honor God in the mind at this level is to live with this continual awareness. It is to remember Him during the day. It's bringing your thoughts back when they get lost. It is to cultivate this presence until it becomes natural. And when that happens, the mind rises, not by effort, but for relationship. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is a desire arising within you, not just to seek God at specific times, but to walk with Him steadily, as Enoch did. Because that's the place where thoughts are truly transformed, where the mind ceases to be a field of struggle, and it becomes a reflection of presence. And if this message is confirming something within you, such as a call to live this intimacy in a deeper way, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Because to declare this is to make room for your mind to continue to be elevated and aligned with everything that comes from heaven. And when that intimacy deepens, when the mind rises and begins to reflect the sky, something even more powerful happens. It ceases to be just a place of occasional connection and becomes a dwelling, no longer a visited space, but inhabited. This is the highest level of honor to God in the mind, when it is not just a battlefield, nor just a place of decisions, but an environment where God's presence remains continuously. Paul reveals this directly in 1 Corinthians 3:16. "Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" That changes everything, because when you understand that you're not just seeking God, but carrying God, His way of thinking is never the same again. The mind ceases to be a common space. It becomes a sacred place. And this is not symbolic. It's real. John 14:17 declares, "The Spirit of truth dwell with you, and it will be in you." It's not something distant. It's not something external. It is internal. It's inside. And perhaps here is something that many have never stopped to consider in depth. If the Spirit of God dwells in you, then your thoughts are no longer yours alone. They are within a place where God is present. And this completely changes the pattern, because what once seemed acceptable no longer fits. Negative, destructive, impure thoughts start to bother differently, not only out of conscience, but by presence. To honor God in the mind at this level is to live with this constant realization. It is knowing that every thought happens within an environment where the Holy Spirit is. It is to carry this reverence not as a weight, but as consciousness. And little by little, something begins to adjust naturally. You don't have to push so hard, because the very presence begins to align. The mind becomes more sensitive, cleaner, more targeted, and what was once a constant struggle begins to give way to coexistence, a continuous communion, a realization that God is not just at specific times, but in all. And that transforms everything, because when the mind becomes a dwelling place, God doesn't just visit, He rules, it influences, it directs from the inside out. And perhaps right now, that truth is changing the way you see yourself. Not as someone trying to reach God, but as someone who already carries His presence within him. And when this awareness is established, the mind ceases to be a commonplace, and it becomes a space where God Himself manifests Himself continuously. And when the mind becomes the abode of God's presence, something inevitable begins to happen. It begins to be confronted on a deeper level. Not just in the big decisions, but in the small, silent agreements that happen within it, because the truth is that all obedience begins before action. It starts in thought. Long before someone does or doesn't do something, there was already an internal decision. There has already been a positioning within the mind. Saul is a clear example of this. He did not lose the kingdom only by an external error. He lost because internally he had already begun to negotiate what God had made clear. He heard the order, but inside his mind he made room for adaptations, justifications, adjustments. And when he was confronted, the answer revealed everything. In 1 Samuel 15:22 it is written, "Behold, obeying is better than sacrificing." This means that God is not impressed by external actions when the mind is already misaligned, because disobedience does not begin in the act. It starts with the thought that says, "That's okay, I can do it my way. It doesn't have to be exactly like this." And these small thoughts, when they are not confronted, become decisions. And decisions, over time, become consequences. James 1:22 states, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only." But to comply, you must first accept internally. It is necessary for the mind to be aligned without resistance, without negotiation. Honoring God in the mind is just that. Obeying before you even act. It is deciding internally that God's will be a priority, even when no one is watching, even when the time has not yet come to act externally. And perhaps here is something that many ignore. There are battles that you win or lose even before any action. In the silence of the mind, in the place where you decide to agree or resist. Because when the mind is already aligned, action becomes a natural consequence. But when the mind is divided, the action becomes unstable. And that requires sincerity. It requires looking inside and realizing where there are still negotiations going on, where there are still subtle resistances, where you already know what God wants, but you have not yet completely decided within you. And when this internal decision happens, something changes. Obedience ceases to be an effort, and it becomes a natural expression of an aligned mind, because it all starts there, in the thought that chooses to say yes to God before anything else happens. And when this inner obedience begins to take hold, something powerful starts to happen inside the mind. The atmosphere changes. Not because of what's going on around you, but because of what you decide to feed inside of you. Gratitude is one of those spiritual keys that few value, but which have the power to completely transform the internal environment. Because while many wait for circumstances to change, to give thanks, those who honor God in their minds learn to give thanks beforehand. Paul lived this impressively, stuck, limited, surrounded by hardship, but with a mind that wasn't stuck. He chose to praise. I chose to be grateful. He chose to keep his thoughts aligned with God, regardless of the scenario. And that wasn't emotion, it was a decision. In 1 Thessalonians 5:18 it is written, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God." It's not in some things, it's not just when everything is fine, it's in everything. And here's something profound. Gratitude doesn't just change how you feel. It changes what you allow to remain in your mind, because the ungrateful mind becomes a breeding ground for murmuring. And murmuring often makes room for unbelief. Negative thoughts begin to grow, to repeat, to dominate. But when gratitude comes in, it occupies that space. She changes the focus. It redirects attention. It reminds you of what God has already done, what He has already said, what remains true, even if the moment is difficult. Psalm 104 states, "Enter through His gates with thankfulness." This shows that gratitude is not just a response, it's an access. It is a path to presence. To honor God in the mind is to choose to give thanks, even when there are no visible signs of change. It is to say, within oneself, God, I still trust, I still recognize, I'm still grateful. And that changes everything, because while many are dominated by what is lacking, those who live in gratitude begin to see what remains, and little by little the mind repositions itself. Anxiety decreases, the pressure loses strength, and a peace begins to occupy the place where there was once unrest, not because everything has been resolved, but because his mind was aligned. And maybe at this moment, God is inviting you to do just that, to change your focus, to get out of what weighs you down and start recognizing what still sustains you. In the next few minutes, something even deeper will unfold, something that can completely change the way you deal with your thoughts on a daily basis. So keep going, because what comes now can be a direct sign from God for your life. And after learning to live in gratitude, a new adjustment needs to happen within the mind. Because it is not enough to change the content of thoughts, it is also necessary to deal with their excess. We live in a time where the mind rarely stops. There are voices, concerns, memories, distractions, all at the same time. And in the midst of so much noise, many say that God does not speak. But the truth is, He keeps talking. The problem is that few can hear. Habakkuk understood this deeply. Instead of getting lost in the noise of circumstances, he made an internal decision. In Habakkuk 2:1 it is written, "I will be upon my keeping, and I will watch to see what will speak to me." He took a stand. He quieted down. He decided to wait. And this reveals something powerful. Listening to God is not just talking to Him, is to create space for Him to speak, because silence, contrary to what many think, is not empty. Silence is ambient. It is where the mind slows down, where thoughts get organized, where the voice of God begins to become perceptible. But this requires discipline, because the mind naturally seeks movement. She wants to fill spaces, she wants to solve, she wants to think non-stop. And without realizing it, this excess becomes a blockage. Psalm 46:10 declares, "Be still and know that I am God." This is not just an invitation, it is an instruction. To quiet down is not just to stop the body, it is to silence the mind. And perhaps here is something that can completely change the way you seek answers. Often, the problem is not a lack of prayer, it is excessive internal noise. You pray, you speak, you ask, but he doesn't stop to listen. It doesn't create space. He is not silent enough to realize what God is already trying to show. Honoring God in the mind is also learning this. It is identifying unnecessary thoughts. It is not getting carried away by everything that arises. It is to bring the mind back to silence, to presence, to attention, and little by little something begins to happen. That confusion subsides, that internal rush slows down, and a clarity begins to emerge, not in a forced way, but naturally, because God doesn't need to scream. He speaks at the right time, in the right way, to a mind that is willing to listen. And when that silence becomes a part of your life, you start noticing something that previously went unnoticed. God has always been speaking. You just had to learn to listen. And when the mind learns to be silent, something that was hidden begins to emerge. Feelings that have been kept. Memories that still carry weight, situations that seem resolved on the outside, but that still take up space on the inside. And it is in this place that one of the most difficult and most liberating decisions needs to happen: forgiveness. Because forgiveness does not begin with the attitude. It starts in the mind. Before any word, before any gesture, there is a thought that decides to let go or continue to arrest. Stephen experienced this at an extreme level. He was being stoned, wronged, rejected. And even then, his mind was not dominated by hatred. At Acts 7:60, he declares, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." That wasn't emotion. It was a decision. He chose in that moment not to allow the pain to turn to bitterness. He decided that it would have no permanent place within his mind. And maybe here is something that many don't realize. Holding a grudge doesn't bind the other person. It holds you. Because every time the thought comes back, every time the memory repeats itself, it is as if the wound is reopened within the mind. Colossians 3:13 states, "Bearing with you and forgiving one another." This is not just advice. It is a path of freedom. To honor God in the mind is to refuse to entertain thoughts that keep the pain alive. It is noticing when the mind begins to revisit old situations and consciously deciding not to continue in that cycle. And that doesn't mean it was easy or that the pain didn't exist. It means that you choose not to allow it to define your thoughts, because as long as the mind is stuck in what has happened, it cannot fully live what God still wants to do. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is someone who comes to your mind, a situation that still weighs, a memory that still bothers us. This is no coincidence. That may be the exact point where God wants to bring deliverance, not forcing you to forget, but inviting you to let go. And when that decision starts within the mind, something powerful happens. A weight comes off, a space opens up, and peace begins to occupy a place that was once full of pain. Because a mind that forgives, it is a mind that frees itself. And after releasing forgiveness and making room within the mind, a new challenge arises that defines the continuity of your spiritual journey: staying focused. Because it's not enough to start well, it is necessary to remain. Pedro lived one of the most supernatural experiences ever recorded. He got out of the boat and walked on the water, something impossible, something that defied any human logic. But at a certain point, something changed, not around, but within it. Matthew 14:31 reveals, "O little faith, why did you doubt?" The doubt did not come out of nowhere. She came in when the focus left Jesus. While his eyes were on him, Peter walked on the impossible. But when his attention was diverted to the wind, to the circumstances, to that which threatened, it began to sink. And this reveals something that needs to be understood in depth. The problem was not the lack of power, it was the lack of focus, because the scattered mind loses connection with that which sustains the supernatural. It begins to alternate between faith and fear, between trust and doubt, between direction and confusion. And perhaps this is one of the greatest challenges of the spiritual life today. It's not a lack of knowledge. It's not a lack of access. It's a lack of constancy. The mind starts out steady, but gets distracted. It starts focused, but divides. Hebrews 12:2 states, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith." This is not just a momentary look, it's an ongoing focus. It's keeping your attention, even when there are other things trying to steal that place. To honor God in the mind is to develop that discipline. It's bringing attention back over and over again whenever it gets lost. It is noticing when thoughts begin to disperse and consciously repositioning the focus. And that takes practice. It requires a decision. It requires not to be carried away by everything that appears, by everything that arises, by everything that tries to occupy space, because the focus doesn't stand alone. It is sustained. And when that discipline begins to strengthen, something powerful happens. Faith becomes more stable. Peace becomes more constant. The mind stops oscillating so easily, and what once seemed difficult to sustain begins to remain. And perhaps as you listen to this, you recognize exactly where your attention has been diverted. Thoughts that take your focus away, situations that steal your peace, distractions that weaken your connection. But it is at this moment that the decision needs to happen. Look back, reposition the mind, to focus again on what really sustains. Because as long as the focus is on Jesus, you remain standing, even in the midst of the impossible. At the end of this video, something even deeper will be released about your life. A connection, a direction, a presence that can completely transform the way you think and live. Stay, because this moment can mark a new level in your walk with God. And when the focus begins to stabilize, when the mind learns to remain steady even in the midst of distractions, a new level of awareness begins to emerge. Eternity is no longer just a distant idea and starts to influence the way you think every day. Paul lived just like that. He was not ignorant of the reality around him, but he was not limited to it. At 2 Corinthians 4:18 he states, "We do not look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are not seen." This reveals a completely different mindset, a mind that is not only attached to what is visible, immediate and fleeting, because when the mind is focused only on the present, it becomes limited. Small problems seem bigger than they really are. Temporary situations seem definitive, and decisions are made based on the now without considering the eternal impact. But when the mind begins to see beyond, everything changes. Priorities are reorganized, worries lose weight, and what really matters begins to gain space. Philippians 3:20 declares, "But our city is in heaven." That doesn't mean disconnection from life here. It means alignment. It means living here, but with the awareness that there is something greater, something eternal, something that goes beyond what is seen. Honoring God in the mind is exactly that, thinking beyond the moment. It is not making decisions based only on what is immediate, but considering what has eternal value. It is living with purpose, knowing that every thought, every choice, every direction is building something that goes beyond the now. And maybe here's something that can completely transform the way you live. When your mind connects with eternity, you stop reacting only to the present and start living with direction. That which once shook you so much begins to lose strength. What seemed urgent, it no longer has the same weight. And a new clarity begins to emerge. A higher, firmer, more aligned vision. Because eternal thoughts produce different lives. They produce firmer decisions. They produce a peace that does not depend on circumstances. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is being adjusted. a change of perspective, a new way of seeing your own life, because when the mind understands that it is not limited to this time, she begins to live in a completely different way. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. Do you feel that this word came at the right time? Then receive that confirmation in faith. Write in the comments, "I believe, Lord," and declare that your mind is being aligned with something much bigger than what you can see right now. Everything that has been built so far brings us to an inevitable point. It is no longer just about understanding, but about delivering. Because the more you realize the power of God-aligned thoughts, the clearer it becomes that this transformation doesn't happen by human strength, but by surrender. The mind that tries to control everything on its own gets tired, confused, and lost. But the mind that surrenders finds rest, direction, and clarity. It is in this place that something really begins to change. When you stop fighting alone and allow God to take over the government of your thoughts. Psalm 139:23-24 expresses just such a moment. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts." This is delivery. It is opening the interior without reservation, allowing God to touch even what you cannot organize on your own. And when you understand that God's thoughts are higher, everything gains a new perspective. As it is written in Isaiah 55:8, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts." This is not distance, it's an invitation, a call to rise higher, to align your mind with that which comes from heaven. Now, this is the time to silence everything around you and turn completely to Him. Let's pray together, surrendering every thought, every weight, and every area of your mind into God's hands, trusting that He is faithful to renew, purify, and establish the truth within you. Beloved Father, your word assures us that the mind can be renewed and aligned with you, and it is with this living hope that we now stand before your presence with an open heart and willing to be transformed. Lord, I thank you for every teaching revealed so far, for every truth that has touched our minds deeply, and for every direction that has brought us closer to you. Thank you that the Lord does not give up on us even when our thoughts are lost, even when our minds are filled with noise, doubts, and fears. Your grace reaches us, your truth corrects us, and your love restores us. Father, at this moment I ask you for strength and wisdom. It teaches us to apply everything we learn. Give us discernment to identify thoughts that do not come from you, courage to reject what keeps us away, and sensitivity to listen to your voice. May our minds be trained in your presence, strengthened by your word, and guided by your Spirit. Lord, I also set before you every need. For those who are mentally tired, burdened by worries, it brings rest and relief. For those who face anxiety, fear, or confusion, it releases peace and clarity. For families that are in conflict, it restores thoughts, brings understanding and reconciliation. For those facing financial difficulties, it opens doors, brings provision and direction. And for those who are sick, visit with your power and release healing, both in body and mind. At this moment, in silence, each person surrenders to you what is deepest within their heart, your struggles, your fears, your most hidden thoughts. Father, we commend everything into your hands. Every thought, every emotion, every worry. We recognize that we can't do it alone, but we trust that the Lord is powerful to completely transform our minds. Take control, govern our thoughts, and align everything within us with your perfect will. May your peace, as written in Philippians 4:7, guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. May we live with clarity, with balance, with firm faith, and with thoughts that honor you every day. We declare that we have the mind of Christ, that we are led by your Spirit, and that our lives are aligned with heaven. Strengthen us to remain steadfast, vigilant, and connected with you at all times. And if that prayer expresses that which is within you, write Amen as an act of faith, declaring that you receive this transformation in your mind. In Jesus' name, Amen. We've reached the end of this journey, but in fact, this is just the beginning of a transformation that can completely change the way you live every day. Honoring God in the mind is not something distant. It is not something reserved for the few. It's a direct call to you. Every thought you allow, every idea you feed, every inner decision you make, all of this builds your spiritual reality. And perhaps today, more than at any other time, God has chosen you to hear this and align something within you, because it's not just about understanding, it is about living. Now I want to ask you a question that only you can answer truthfully. What are you going to do with all that you just received? And let me tell you something very directly, but with all affection. I'm really happy to know that you're here with me so far. It shows that there is something special going on inside you. You are not here by chance. You are part of this journey, and your presence here has value. So if this video spoke to you, I want to invite you to take a simple but important step. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these messages that strengthen your mind and your faith. And more than that, I want to meet you. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Let's create an environment of faith here, where one strengthens the other, and where we can pray together. And it doesn't stop here, because what you have seen today is only a part of what God still wants to reveal to you. In the next video, we'll go even deeper into this understanding and show you how to practically live this constant connection with God in a way that transforms not only your mind, but your entire life. There is something prepared that can open your spiritual vision even more, and you don't want to miss it. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.